Hello everyone, today we talk about the Mischling category, forged in the crucible of Nazi Germany's racial legislation, emerging as one of the most intricate, contradictory, and bureaucratically tortured elements of the regime's attempt to impose an absolute biological hierarchy on human society, except this stuff had basically nothing to do with even any concrete biological standard per se, which is, I think, incredibly interesting and useful in a time in history when the newer generations are coming up with new sort of fictional historical interpretations of which we are confronted, especially not much with a change of the historical paradigm, because history remains there. If anything, it's people that are basically collapsing in their neurocognitive capacity in general terms. But that is incredibly strange. If you think about this in a strictly historical sense and you actually study National Socialism, because you would think, for example, a famous figure recently in social networks said something like, Hitler was trying to create a racial empire of some sort. And definitely from a broader ethnocultural point of view, this was true. But genetically speaking, things, at least in sort of historical Nazism, were not really measured in genetic terms. In fact, they were measured on basically a cultural understanding of what, in this case, the Jews were. And this actually turned out to be one of the single most macroscopically inefficient and, as you know, genocidally disastrous mechanisms in the history of mankind, right? Because there were lots of massacres and exterminations in the history of mankind. The reason why people today sort of challenge the narrative that the Holocaust, first of all, existed, because that's what the bottom line would like to be. It's just internet stuff, right? It's just memory. It's not what happens where people actually study history. Go against everything that you think was part of an allegedly unintelligible narrative is something that, functions for the shock effect 10 seconds after you send that, and after that nobody remembers, nor of you nor of the question anymore, and history will keep being made the same way, right? It's not, unless civilization collapses properly, in a broader sense, in an elite sense, which is not what actually happens during times of actual crisis, people will that will come to probably the forgetfulness of so many different things. But what happens in these times in history is rather people collapsing and just like some elites remaining in charge. And at that point, this happened in other times in Western civilization, so sort of felt the need to rewrite history and or to sort of give a picture that would obscure what actually happened, right? The reason why the Holocaust is actually so relevant in many ways is paradoxically what we will see now, stemming from a disastrous miscalculation of the Nazis, meaning that one thing can understand, ethnic violence, tensions, conflict across centuries. There are some religions, some groups that always hated one another and that ended up targeting one another in the actual structures of power and even causing genocide, like in many other cases. The case of the Holocaust is much more striking. That makes things, and this is what most people don't have the realization of, historically relevant, is exactly because history is relative to one another, right? There was truly nothing ever like the Holocaust, right? You can't pick, the genocide of the Armenians, Belgians, to exterminate the Congolese. It's the same way. It's inherently different, and it's inherently driven by a very specifically engineered ideology that was also loaded by hundreds more of years of Judenhass, right? In Central Europe, in Eastern Europe, it was incredibly strong. There is a reason for that, which mostly stems from the massive difference of living conditions of Central and Eastern European Jewry compared to Western European Jewry in general. This is not, in fact, even much to do with the history of expulsion, persecution, of discrimination, and so on. What stands out in terms of the Holocaust in itself is, again, conventionally the fact that you would think why it's a bit of a moral judgment in a abstract sense, that is to say, and also a relatively captious one. Like, how could such a developed people like the German? By the way, it's not like Germany was in absolute terms this overwhelmingly hyper advanced people compared to other ones that existed in the West in the time. They were very advanced. Surely that's what the thing says, is an industrial society, very advanced, with great sort of scientists and men of letters and so on. How could they do something so horrifying and something so sort of repulsive also in merely traditional terms? Because all people think that extermination per se, and especially in the truly post-traditional mass society industrial scale that we see with the peculiarly genocidal intent of the Holocaust, is something that defies properly the logic behind Indo-European tradition, namely the fact that in order to win, and studying the differences, for example, Nordic racism during the 1930s is extremely important to understand, because there were different currents that believed different things, right? There is, for example, a work by Evola that criticizes the so-called neo-paganism in the 1930s, mostly stemming from the German, the Nordic world, that was essentially divinizing, or in that sense absolutizing, an idea of contingent state, of human reality, ignoring the transcendental meaning of older tradition. And in tradition, actually, there is a dimension of sort of bloodshed that is actually sort of necessary, even to a degree, and or at least unavoidable, a bit like also in Christian teaching, etc. Like, there is a human dimension that can barely be fixed. And so we know that there are going to be wars, we know that there are going to be massacres and so on, because we are imperfect and so on. But ideally, God transfigures everyone, right? And in Christian tradition, by the way, and still, of course, in a discriminatory way towards the Jews, the notion that the Jews, by the way, must remain existing, actually the only people that should remain existing till the end time, essentially as a witness to the fact that Christ was right, over sort of the Jewish basis, of which Christianity is an offshoot, and so also in a more transcendental and beyond, in fact, the merely Jewish historical, ethnic, religious bulk, is inherently one of the single most specific elements of Christian identity, and European identity in particular even more, right? Because at some point, Europe pioneered Christendom, and some could simply say, well, but National Socialism was fundamentally also, if not openly anti-Christian, at some point the end game, just like for many other groups, including in ethnicities, by the way, just like with like the Slavs, right? That were the useful tool on the Eastern Front, just in the fight against the Soviets. And by the way, over that sort of racial discrimination of the Slavs, and even partly of the Jews, because that's actually very deep, and we will talk about this, especially in the series about Hitler. The Nazis really lost the war, right, in terms of mass scale, for different reasons. And what the Holocaust in this sense is normally read like by people is that sort of National Socialism, there's also a complex thing. It's not merely just what Hitler thought, it's also what essentially the party had to adapt to for German society, was an overwhelmingly Christian society, for example, is mostly seen today as basically a purely genetic discrimination. It's essentially as if, Nazis discriminating against this or that group merely on the basis of their genetic background. It would have been, in that sense, scientifically calculated. Of course, none of this is actually, it's even what they surely thought about this, but in the way they would implement it in Germany, and this is more like, other than a Nazi thing per se, also a Statal thing, a German thing, a national thing, a counter thing, was merely a matter of identity and social frequentations. And this is what I want to make this video for, because, again, there was a heavily racial profiling, also just through phenotypes, and there were the means to, of course, genetically sort of pioneer or further sort of research and discrimination and so on. But fundamentally, the thing stuck to an incredibly inefficient, which is also one of the actually more specific features sometimes of National Socialist and even, broadly speaking, German failure during world wars and in other circumstances, because they were decisions taken just to sort of take the bull by the horn, so to say. So in a transient fashion that had to work in some way, and that ended up being a disaster, even just aside from the same genocide, but probably for the reasons of the genocide. That in the sense are much worse than you think they are, right? In the sense that there is no romanticized version of how the Nazis at some point decided to discriminate against and starting to immediately, by the way, since 1933, they were already starting to deport them. This is something well witnessed, and eventually exterminate the Jews with a final solution, not just in Germany, but of course in all the lands that the Nazis at some point came to control. For example, in Italy, the racial laws were issued essentially in parallel with Nazi Germany, but the actual deportation of the Jews started in practice. Jews were already discriminated against, their activities were cracked, exactly how it would happen in other places. Where these laws existed, because this was partly also true for many other fascist countries in Europe, but they were started to be actually deported only when the Italians signed the armistice with the Allies, and the Nazis, as you know, in parallel took over control of the entire peninsula, given that the Italian armed forces were paralyzed without a head and so on. So different ways of seeing things, but also like for such a big thing like the Holocaust was something incredibly, truly incredible in the motivations and in the practical selection and discrimination of the people who had eventually to be eliminated, right? And one thing that strikes you, and that everybody can see, by the way, if you ever watch any documentary and interview on the Shoah and so on, is that many Jews who fled Nazi Germany because of racial laws and so on, we'll see now better, are ostensibly very white, essentially Aryan prototypes, right? Naturally, there are many Jews that surely had historically also come from further east in Europe, that had surely their connections with the older Turkic Republic. Think about the Khazars that had partially converted to Judaism back in the High Middle Ages, and so on. So we're not going to make a history of the Jewish people, and not even here in particular in Central Eastern Europe, but there was in part that kind of racial profiling. It was somehow feasible. But aside from for example, very strong steps injection, aside from probably the Khazar Jews, if you want to look at that, the Ashkenazis in Central Europe, you realize that the majority of people were very blended in an ethnic sense. These were secular mechanisms. It is true, again, that in Central Europe, the Jews were normally a larger minority than in other parts of Europe, and that they historically had a much lower socioeconomical status to begin with, and this was actually one of the major reasons for their eventual discrimination, paradoxically, against the conspiracy theory that the Jews control everything. As a matter of fact, this had been prominent, of course, also German origin, Jewish, powerful people and so on, but most of them were actually very, very poor, right? And that's also something you would not see, in the Netherlands or Italy on a regular basis, where in spite of discrimination, they had a completely different history in many ways. But there is no doubt that not just the steps end in Germany, but that if you look at some sort of ethnic, because that's how the Nazis eventually came to identify them Christian, right? Surely many of them would have been of Jewish ancestry, but being part of a conventional Christian community, historically, they were not seen as Jews, and so they were, as we'll see now, but the racial laws of Nazi Germany basically never considered as anything else, but in that sense, actual Aryans. This is also debatable because, of course, Aryanity was fully understood as also something very phenotypical. So, of course, if someone was dark and so on, this would have been understood and seen in broader cultural, personal terms in that way, right? But in Central Europe, there are very dark people, for example. There is a lot of Turkic influence from the steppes. There is with all the peoples that we discussed in many videos about warfare, I want to make, for example, a video on Kuman, warfare, common history, because especially of the use of those peoples in places like Hungary up to sort of Bohemia, Germany, regularly plundering, and we've seen this also in this series about the siege of Vienna, this Turco-Mongol populations from the east that routinely came there. But if we look at the same sort of average German population, I mean, Himmler has clearly Far East Asian ancestry. I mean, it's undeniable just from a phenotypic point of view. Heydrich, that is normally conceived as this was the prototype of Aryan German, he has a pretty self-evidently and actually disproportionately pronounced Ugrian nose. It's impossible not to see or not to understand this. And so what you are going to see now with the Nuremberg laws and the issue of the Mischlinge is something that, if seen in an actually ethno-cultural and genetic historical sense, makes the Holocaust way more disturbing than it actually was, right? And we will see now, in part, like all the mess that was triggered by this incredibly inefficient, other than particularly cruel, racial legislation, right? And by the way, I'm not even one of those people that does not point out that, I don't know, we're not here to just blame Nazi Germany. Eugenetic laws were present very much openly in Sweden at this point, in the United States, and it would even continue historically later on in time. So we're looking also at a time in which paradox, and this is also the most interesting thing, the West had come to interrogate itself about the connection between sort of genetics, culture, morals, ethnicity, and so on, but had come up with some forms of discrimination that was all but the fruit of some traditional understanding, wisdom, or historical hierarchy of the cases of the various peoples, the conquered, the conquerors, and so on. We'll understand now, and I mean, the course of World War II in and of itself, considering that Nazi fascism essentially justified their own existence on the basis of military victory, well, I think that in the outcome of World War II really poses some even bigger question marks, right? And we will, if anything, talk about this more and better on Schwerpunkt at some point. Now, back to the topic, like the Nuremberg laws, right? There were essentially two anti-Jewish. I hate, by the way, the term anti-Semitic. I understand the Semites are a broader group of people. It's not like even today, all the surge against of Judenhass that is unfortunately as completely normal in all times of crisis when the fourth estate collapses and they have to find a scapegoat and end up brutally repressed. At the end of the day, the term itself does not mean anything. It's not like people are discriminating against the Arabs because they're Semitic, right? It seems that some allegedly right-wing people are more interested in supporting Islamism against sort of the Israel, the Jews, Western allies, and the West itself signing, given that Islamists are notoriously signing, as we dreadfully see today with communism, with Marxism, and they're able to deprive themselves of any trace of morality left just by showing you that they're willing to do anything just for how much they hate you and they want to destroy you, as a matter of fact. And that seems the single most overt threat to Western civilization, right? And that it's impossible not to see how finding other alleged causes is just like an exercise for the mentally fragile, feeble. Now, the Nuremberg laws, we have these two anti-Jewish laws. That is the Reich citizenship law and the law for the protection of German blood and German honor. This is the key things that they were promulgated with also carefully staged solemnity. Obviously, given the regime's highly advanced scenographic capacity in that sense, on September the 15th, 1935, during the annual Nazi Party rally in Nuremberg, and given, in this sense, precise, enforceable detail through the first supplementary decree of November the 14th, 1935, creating a graduated system of racial classification that depended and this is, I can't stress this enough, it depended almost exclusively. Here, this is the most important thing of it all. This racial classification depended almost exclusively on the documented religious affiliation of grandparents, rather than any modern genetic test. Again, it's not like the Nazis. This is not an excusatory video for the Nazis, that we look, they were not actually genetically discriminating. No, they weren't doing that because they didn't know practically how to do this thing to begin with, right? And surely in the various Judenhass, there was a broader cultural and societal profiling. So it was not just about genes. But for a regime that was prominently in favor also in all its iconography and its sort of visual propaganda about the image of the Aryan, this problem became objectively ridiculous in the moment in which, as you've seen here with the first guy in the picture that I will talk about now, Werner Goldberg, there were Germans of Western descent that looked much more Aryan than other Germans, say, I don't know, dark-haired, brown-eyed, and everything, that would have been considered Aryan just because they were Christian and not Jewish in a religious sense. Now, these laws not only targeted Jews, but laid the groundwork for similar racial restrictions on other groups, right? And this is more stringent indeed and clear. The Roma, so the Gypsies, whose Gypsy problem prompted draft legislation for registration, sterilization, and deportation in parallel with the Jewish classifications. And again, I can't stress this enough. There were incredibly Nordic Jews that were genocide together with these other people. I can't stress that enough, all right? And I'm sure even among the Romans, there would have been some sort of Aryan ancestry of some, but in general, like if we look at the broader German population, it's very difficult to make the case for many Jews that they actually looked anything different from the rest of their so-called Aryan counterpart. A grandparent was deemed fully Jewish if he or she had ever been enrolled in a Jewish congregation, regardless of later conversion to Christianity, intermarriage, or complete secularization. So essentially, if you had been affiliated to any kind of Jewish community, regardless of it all, you were considered Jewish. You understand that from a legal standpoint, the possibility to research this background for your ancestors, right? What had been through, World War I, the fall of the Second Reich, the Weimar Republic, the rise of the in a 20th, 19th century German, was absolutely ridiculous, right, and unlikely. And this was incredibly inefficient at the end of the day to, as in terms of consequences, given the fact that in fact there was no clear way to determine who had any sort of Jewish ancestry in a couple of generations before. Now, regardless of later conversion, fragile. This archival criterion, dependent on old congregational membership rolls, baptismal certificates, synagogue records, and marriage documents that officials could recover through relentless genealogical searches, produced a classification system that appeared meticulous and scientific only on paper, but in fact proved deeply inconsistent, administratively nightmarish, and frequently arbitrary in practice, right? Two notes. After World War I, as you know, Germany lost some territories in the east. So what happened, especially in places like the Baltic and etc. You can imagine what probably the status and societal structures were in those countries to even just be able to record this data. With refugees, destructions during the war, and so on. You can imagine the mess. The second point that I think is very interesting is a matter of societal control, meaning that if you are, say, to use this racial discrimination and profiling in a more malleable way, you can actually make more political leverage in terms of private clienteles and so on. We point out in particular, compared to the Soviet Union, this is absolutely true, that Nazi Germany had a much more efficient and centralized form of political and mass control in general. In the Soviet Union, everyone was constantly terrorized. Nobody understood who was the friend and the enemy. Population was sort of subserviently subjected into sort of pure paranoia. Paradoxically, it's the Nazi racial laws that compact like that resistance that also was extremely costly to begin with, that allowed the Soviets to eventually turn the tide. And the general picture is indeed that Nazism seemed like, well, there's a guy at the top, who the SS is, who the Jews are, also because they're very specifically discriminated openly. There are marks, there are, again, early deportations and so on. But the truth is that if you truly live in a country like Germany, where there is a very strong Jewish majority historically, and you have all the issues that we observed also from the previous generations, the disasters of the war, the deportations, the refugees, and so on, it becomes extremely difficult and as such arbitrarily instrumental and exploitable to fabricate some accusations of Jewish identity, of Jewry, if you want to control people. And not much in the sense that, at least I'm not aware in the research of how this worked really, how we know about this at the time. Not much that the Nazis were sort of cracking down on more, in the sense, also fake Jews than the actual ones already deported and exterminated, but that there were actually lots of people of actual Jewish ancestry that were controlled and ended up even in important positions of power, to be constantly blackmailed, to obey the regime, including, for example, in carrying out the Holocaust, penalty, like the exposure, private. And this is very interesting, by the way, because the mess that really happened in Nazi Germany, aside from the war and everything, is still very much alive today. For example, like in Germany, there's a very strong sense of defense of private property, which is absolutely good and very positive, but deriving from largely a societal reticence, paranoia. So you can't ring somebody's door, for example. It's illegal, because the idea is that especially after the war, of course, the main, whichever, like the Nuremberg trial was, executed. The many, we're talking tens of thousands of people were condemned by probably also the German state outside of the Nuremberg Treaty. They did it on their own, but all the rest was settled. In this sense, a bit what was happening here with the Jews, like let's simply cut this with a hatchet. You're left, you're right, and let's go by that, not to create further complications, because we objectively don't even know how to handle this thing, right? Given that also for Nazism, the Jewish question was such of a huge issue, right? And I would think this is a very interesting, also psychological perspective within the Nazi regime, because again, in countries like Germany or Poland, historically, Jews were really a lot of people. As we also dreadfully know, by the measure, they disappeared during the war. All right, we're talking millions. And I may make a video about the Holocaust in explaining how we know what we know and how sort of unequivocal the entire matter actually is, if we really want to be precise about that. And mostly just because today that would be a video making lots of views, I'm sure, because it always ends up like this, like highly crafted historical videos about different topics. Nobody watches it, but if it is the drama thing, like the thing that everybody talks about, oh my God, I want to listen to what Schwerpunkt thinks about it, it's ridiculous. All right, let's be honest about this. Now, back to this mess, like individuals, essentially, with 3 or 4 such Jewish grandparents, as we said before, so that had just, maybe they were even Christian converts, but once back in the day, they had participated in a Jewish community, so those were considered legal Jews. Individuals with 3 or 4 such Jewish parents were automatically and unequivocally classified as full Jews. In fact, full Jude or Ist Jude. this again, at the beginning of the video, I said that the only discrimination was religious, not even, right? Because you see, it was based on descent from people who had belonged to communities, right? That probably at some point, even, I don't know, there were lots of atheists already at the time. Maybe they didn't even care about being Jew. But in any case, so if you had 3 or 4 such Jewish grandparents, you would be immediately stripped of Reich citizenship, right? As if you had essentially the majority of your grandparents as Jew, you were reduced to the legal status of mere state subject, deprived of political rights, voting privileges, and any meaningful protection against exclusion from professions, social life, deportation, or ultimately physical annihilation, as we know. This is also really fascinating because it was not even understood, for example, in terms of a female line. It was truly understood just like in a congregational sense at some point, at any point in their life. The intermediate zone, however, and this is where also things got really complicated and politically undermining in a society, in a totalitarian one. If you, for example, listen to Hitler's speeches, you realize that much of the general hatred and angst and so on was directed to the betrayers of Germany from the within. Right, and at that point, it wasn't much about the Jews because they weren't taken out, but all those who in any way or case were to essentially roll backwards. It's a bit like saying, and that you had suspicion of to begin with. It's just like the Slavs, right? They were truly classified as Untermenschen, but in this sense, they were kept alive in the moment because they were purposeful for the war. And they literally told them, right? It's not like the Nazis, made any mystery to this. There's also the completely macroscopically debunked myth that the Wehrmacht was sort of clean of this. It's anti-Jewish feelings, and the entire sort of Nazi creed was overwhelmingly, hyperly documentedly, and sort of quite openly expressed within the Wehrmacht. That was largely sort of anti-Jewish, just constitutionally speaking, aside from also the war crimes that they committed for that matter. But this is very well known. It was product of that society. And it's not even just National Socialism. Again, it's not like Hitler invented anti-Jewish feelings in Germany. Those existed, like in many other countries in Europe, for quite a long time. It was in many ways, because there are people who weirdly trying to launder also the image of the German. We talked about this also recently in the video about Rommel. They say, only the SS did certain things. And these are normally Nazi apologists, so they actually believe themselves. They have all prejudices against the Jews. No, the Wehrmacht did not do anything. I mean, these people literally, like if you end up actually supported them as you do, they actually believe that all this stuff. And it's also pretty historically specific. I mean, there's no way to debunk this historically. It's incredibly well documented. And we can get back on that as well. I also made a video about the SS explaining this relation with the Wehrmacht that surely was less indoctrinated, was less radicalized and everything compared to the SS, but not because as a general population, the Germans did not share these feelings. Always remember this, that there is no such thing. This is a great alibi that unfortunately we often hear also in, I don't like the word democratic, but let's say conventionally democratic environments, that it's just like it's the fault of the leaders, because the people were actually good people. BS on that. There are two options only, right? In any case, the decisive moral majority of a people is the only reason why there is a specific government, right? There is no such thing in a broader politological, even strategic and sociological sense, where there is a government who rules a country that does not respond to it. Right? It does not exist in any time in history. And when we say the decisive moral majority, may well be that, yes, maybe the decisive moral majority is contained, but is wielded by less people in general. And this is true for every people. Like, it's obvious that countries are, do you think that people rule? Thank God. No country in the world people ever ruled. There are just better people at the top that rule for them, because even as sort of terrible, like average people understand at least that they are incapable to the point that they have to delegate power to someone else. There is no such thing like direct democracy. In fact, it shouldn't be called democracy for that reason, because no demos ever rules in that regard. You can also have, in this sense, especially in totalitarian regimes, and this is especially very evident, I don't know, still today in at least in the legacy also of the Soviet Union, in authoritarian regimes like the Russian ones, and that people are broken morally. So it takes just very few people in actually a disastrously led and poor environment to just go make the whole group go on supporting one leader, right? But in that sense, the decisive moral majority may be also way more shared among populations that have a stronger public opinion, that more directly participate. This is basically the West as we know that. So an authoritarian model, it doesn't tell you anything. Actually, historically speaking, it generally stems from weaker people, right? And in this sense, it would be very interesting to assess National Socialism in a broader perspective of in the German past, because this was a country that 200 years before was into medieval feudalism. I would like to stress this. The average person was somebody else's person, all right? So this had a radical impact, probably in the mentality of Middle Europeans in many ways, all right? Aside from this, there was this gray area, right? Generating so these in-betweens, the Mischlinge, that this is today's topic, the greatest definitional complexity and persistent internal conflict within the regime, that again is not good. If you have to fight a world war, you can't go on with this kind of idea that there's a part of your population that you infiltrate, that is present everywhere, that however somehow we will get rid of them sooner or later, or at least we don't know what to do. In any case, they're not really like us. This is not a very even, for example, fascistic ideology, because that is at least ideally intending to have some level of equal value, but at least in loaded value of all the members. But there is also a concept of hierarchical integration. Now, who are these people? Well, these are people with precisely two Jewish grandparents that are described in the way we said before, so not even necessarily Jewish as we would more conventionally intend them, but legally Jewish by Nazi Germany standards, that were placed in the most contested position for this reason. Like, they were by default designated Mischlinge that put their grandchildren in this most contested position. They were by default, in fact, designated as Mischlinge, so essentially a blend of some sort of the first degree half-Jews carrying substantial but not total disabilities, all right? Yet four specific aggravating conditions explicitly listed in Article 5.2 of the supplementary decree elevated them to the status of Geltungsjude, which means essentially something like Jews by legal reckoning still, thereby equating their fate in every practical respect with that of full Jews. This is important as well because it's still a fairly harsh term, like these are half Jews. So they weren't, the sense here is that the Nazis would have been saying, well, okay, you're not a Jew 50% plus one, but basically everything wrong that you do, that basically brings you closer to a Jew, makes you truly that 1% more, and so you're going to be considered a full Jew in that way. And so what were the conditions that would bring you to that? Well, the first was being a member of a Jewish congregation on November the 14th, 1935, or any later joining of such a congregation. Right, so up to that date, being married to a full Jew, this was the second condition on the decree date, or entering such marriage afterward. Being the child of a mixed marriage concluded after September the 15th, 1935's ban on unions between Jews and citizens of German or kindred blood. This was the third. And the last and fourth was being the offspring of an extramarital relationship with a full Jew, born out of wedlock after July 31st, 1936. So again, remember this, you were counted as a Jew, even, for example, in case of the extramarital situation, you would have hated the situation. just for obvious reasons. But if this guy turned out to be a Jew for some reason, like you were considered, you see, as essentially vehiculating some genetic, because this was transmitted in a familiar sense, but not in a family communitarian sense. You were just like the fruit of an extramarital relationship, regardless of, like, again, society at the time was not so obviously dissolute as today. So people tended to be truly outcast at that point, if the consequence of such a relation. But in that sense, you see, that person was not even genetically considered, but since it was a Jew by congregational identity, you would carry that. You understand how ridiculous this is. The last one is pretty nasty, right? But it still was in consequence of the idea that that's how a Jew would be identified 100% as an individual in Nazi Germany, right? So that was enough for you to, by being his son, to ideally being fruit of such ethnicity, or another, even though it was not genetically investigated. So this is sort of heavy stuff, obviously. Now, if none of these four circumstances applied, you had this paradox, that is to say, the person remained a first-degree Mischling, rather than being reclassified upward to Geltungsjude, right? Persons with exactly one Jewish grandparent were uniformly classified as Mischlinge of the second degree. Those were quarter Jews, a status that imposed fewer immediate and catastrophic disabilities, but still branded the individual as racially compromised for the rest of their lives. The 1939 Reich census, officially the minority one, or Volkszählung with supplementary cards, the Ergänzungskarten, requiring details on all four grandparents' racial status, resulting in roughly 410,000 such cards collected, carried out under mounting bureaucratic coercion and amid growing demands for citizens to document every branch of their ancestry. Recorded approximately 72,000 to 72,738 first-degree Mischlinge, with minor statistical variations reported as, again, like here is not so important, it's the same number basically in some other publications, roughly 39,000 to 42,000 second-degree Mischlinge within the pre-1938 Altreich, Old Reich territory. So that was obviously, like we were saying before, was also considered, excluding some annexed areas like parts of Czechoslovakia not fully covered in the initial count as well. Now, intermarriage patterns suggested second-degree Mischlinge were roughly twice as numerous as first-degree overall, thus implying a broader pool of 125 to 130,000 second-degree and potentially tens of thousands more with distant ancestry who evaded full registration, because of course this did not go to, great-grandparents, right? In that sense, it becomes less likely just by demic statistic, but there would have been some Germans who actually had, in this sense, legally, like from previous ancestors, more sort of legal Jewish ancestry, and some people who were, in this sense, discriminated for their own more recently, even less, but still legally registered one, that were completely unscathed by this. And in fact, that were treated as full German blood, right? Again, they were conflating blood with whichever association. There were, again, some Jews that were persecuted, that escaped. Fortunately, some others who were exterminated were actually very, very German in outlook, stereotypically German, even sort of actually fairer than the average German. Now, these numbers, though, approximate and inevitably incomplete. This was the problem we were talking about before as well. Given the enormous difficulty of tracing every lineage across generations, revealed the existence of a large population segment that the regime simultaneously feared as a source of hidden racial pollution, stigmatized as inferior, and yet found extraordinarily difficult to eliminate wholesale without causing unacceptable disruption to social stability, professional expertise, economic functioning, and above all, military manpower during the total war that was already being prepared and then waged. Right? And this at large is true also for the Jews, right? One thing is, again, profiling them mostly for reasons that are actually more complicated than they sound, right? We will talk again about the history of Nazism and fascism. We've seen how Jews had always been targeted. We've seen how during World War I, I talk about this in the video about the Freikorps, in order to justify again the backstabbing, the fact that Germany could have not been defeated hadn't there been some allogen element. Otherwise, this during the war, by the way, when things were already not optimal, the same German military carried out this investigation, trying to essentially demonstrate that the Jews were within the army proper, like less active on the front lines, that were sabotaging from the rear the supply lines, that were cowards and backstabbers and all. This obviously because the idea was that we're also largely socialistic, which actually in part, so this is true, but also in part not true. And we'll, again, that's the thing, the contentious thing we must talk about at some point, but this very inquiry found out that the Jews were actually, for some reason, disproportionately present in the front lines, and in this sense, fighting in the hardest of situations. And the same German military at that point essentially destroyed its own inquiry because they couldn't publish that. And that tells you already the mentality of it. Like, there is this incredibly volitive sort of, we must do this, we have to give the strong signal. It's just like the same Nuremberg laws. It was the same thing. It was just taking the unlikely decision of equating some genetic ancestry that was very much to the sort of the heart of racialism, and especially again the Nordic one, the one mostly followed by Nazi Germany, through some religious affiliation at some point also in the past. So in this sense, also regardless of any actual ethnic measurement, if that was the standard, all right, it was, again, still an identitary point. It was made because the Jews were accused to have this will of sabotage and so on. And again, the associations with, Bolshevism, with probably the red backstabbing, etc., were, at this point in history, especially in Central Eastern Europe at least, fabricated on the basis of the fact that many of these dispossessed Jews living in appalling conditions. I mean, while the Germans had the Enlightenment, the Jewish communities in Central Europe were just beginning to read. That's how sort of emarginated but also undiluted they were, and that's why the issue arose, also in places like Poland, etc. But without any other actual evidence that there would have been any malintent from the side of these people, that in many cases were also fanatic nationalists at some point. I mean, as a medievalist, I always like to bring up the example of Kantorowicz, who, wrote the masterpiece of Frederick II, who was recognized as a hero, right? Also a World War I veteran, for that matter, for having magnified the greatness of the German Empire during the Middle Ages, and he was the first one that was incredibly disappointed and in disbelief when he was essentially ousted from the academia. Actually, he had also family killed in the Holocaust. He fled famously to the United States. At that point, he was, and that's perhaps the most painful thing, that he rejected his own work that he wrote as a German Jew on the grandeur, it's a masterpiece of medievalistics, of Frederick II, because it had sort of ideologically contributed, in his view, to also the same German nationalism, the rise of National Socialism in particular. These are stories that, frankly, there's a book that I loved when I was a kid. It was Der Wiedergefundene Freund. I don't know if you have ever heard of it, but The Newly Found Friend. I don't remember what's the title in English, honestly. But that's as heartbreaking as it gets. I mean, it's something about the enormous and rashly unchecked kind of rise to power of such an ideology, and the mass green light in an orbit without much of a clue about what could and would actually happen, and still creating these fractures in society. Because you see, now they started realizing that a great part of the German population were also Mischlinge. And so the Jews, okay, were taken out. But what about these people? They were considered racially inferior, and that were, however perfect Germans, there were also many Jews that were exterminated. This is heavy. This is not something that leaves a trace. It's a perspective that is often missed, because the idea is that we sort of bought the premise ourselves that there were such a thing like the Germans, it's a thing like the Jews. And there wasn't such a thing. It was a whole people in general, and even if Jews maintained surely connection to their community, to their religion, they had at some point also socialistic sympathies, etc. Many of them also didn't, and many of them were actually also uninterested in religion. They were, like, in this sense, also children of Jews that had perhaps, like, also the decisive 50% plus one kind of fault of being a Jew according to legalism. But they didn't, up to the rise of National Socialism, they didn't even care or understand or live as Jews, right? And that's terrible, because these were literally people who were living just like any other, and maybe even buying in the same, and even in a higher sense. There were people even essentially from the nobility that had such connections. So it's incredibly strange and weird, because remember, there were the converts as well. So if you had married, again, as, I don't know, a Christian after having converted to Judaism, that would have been seen before the racial laws as normal, because you could abjure the thing. Here, the Nazis were bringing things to a level that frankly posed many, many perplexities to many people. Right, and that, again, is not much good to have among this population. Also because if you're tempested, this is also very psychologically obvious, if you're tempested with the notion that you are not really a pure-blooded person, that therefore you're inherently evil and whatever, you're not really going to be that cooperative with the regime. You're going to think that after all, like, you'd better be out of this, and or like, imagine even if, I don't know, Germany wins the war, you're going to have this stigma forever anyway, for a lifetime. There's nothing you can do about this. All right. And many of these people had children, by the way. I mean, consider this, right? There would be a child of some of these Mischlinge that would not be deported, because he was not considered to be a Jew. So we often think about, again, you're a Jew, so basically your child. You don't think about the Mischlinge perspective as well. But there were some parents that you would see disappear from their children that were literally taken out by the regime, and their children were supposed to live on, right? Now, the lived experience of most Mischlinge stood also in stark, almost unbearable contrast to the regime's ideological fantasy of indelible racial contamination, or the simple, again, sort of division between two races in the same blood of the Germans. This was evidently not the case. The vast majority of the Mischlinge had been raised entirely within German cultural norms. Between roughly 66 and 80%, depending on regional variation and the specific census year, identified as Protestants, interestingly enough, because naturally, remember, before World War II, there were many more Protestants in Germany. Today, Catholics are still prevalent, right? And that's also because much of eventually East Germany was lost, and that was historically, as you know, Protestant. And now a direct legacy of the spread, widespread conversions among assimilated urban German Jews in the 19th century. They tendentially prefer to convert to Protestantism, generally adopting thus the dominant confession of their locality, with the 1933 figure around 77% Protestant, dropping to two-thirds by 1939 due to annexations bringing in more Catholic areas like Vienna and Prague. Catholic Mischlinge were proportionately more numerous in territories annexed after 1938, such as Austria, following the Anschluss, of the annexation of the country in March 1938 and the Sudetenland, German-speaking border regions of Czechoslovakia, next in October 1938 after the Munich Agreement, where long-established Catholic communities of partial Jewish descent had existed for generations under Habsburgic rule. All right, think also about the liberal policies of Joseph II to a sort of more habitually multicultural reality. Many Mischlinge discovered their classified status only when official genealogical investigations suddenly invaded their lives, by the way. It's not like they actually even knew of this. This was often just triggered by routine bureaucratic requirements. Employment applications, university admissions, marriage licenses, or military conscription paperwork needed such clarifications. At that point, you had to carry out those reasons. Just think about all the time wasted in doing this as well. Now, their mother tongue was German. Their schooling followed standard German curricula. Their friendships, social circles, and frequently their political attitudes actually were indistinguishable from those of their Germans. Many of these people were National Socialists. This is also a thing that you rarely hear. Many Jews, in the sense that were brought concentration camps, had actually been National Socialists themselves. And in many ways, they didn't even know they were Jewish before they were deported to death, right? So it's unbelievable. Now, a not insignificant number had even absorbed, in fact, the prevalent anti-Jewish rhetoric of the surrounding society regarding their own racial defect as a shameful private burden to be concealed. That was also the case. They were hiding in that rather than as a basis for any sense of ethnic solidarity with the Jewish community. In other words, they had started hating the Jews, especially in public, because they also had this complex of being themselves sort of Jews, at least by this mechanism, and being ashamed of that because of their own anti-Jewish feelings. Now, from the very beginning of the regime in 1933, the Mischlinge were, by the way, Mischlinge is not even just a good brand for your identity. Like, you always feel like a half breed or something. The Mischlinge were subjected to a steadily tightening cascade of discriminatory measures. The April 1933 law for restoration of the professional civil service had, for example, already enforced the retirement of quote-unquote non-Aryans, initially defined as anyone with at least one Jewish parent or grandparent, from state employment, unless protected by the frontline fighter clause for the First World War veterans or their immediate descendants. This is also interesting. They were seen to a degree like World War I as a redeeming character. But things were just worsening from this point onward. Naturally, in 1933, Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany, and in 1935 you have immediately the Nuremberg framework that intensified and systematized these exclusions with ruthless precision, by the way. First-degree Mischlinge were barred from almost public sector jobs, from admission to qualifying university programs, particularly medicine, law, teaching, and other regulated professions, from any position involving supervisory authority over quote-unquote pure German employees, and from numerous leadership roles in private associations, sports clubs, and cultural organizations. Remember, among these people, there were even people who were actually, according to this law, more prevalently Jewish, going back generations, than some people that were ruling on them from a position of actually National Socialists, anti-Jewish, but finding out that they actually were ancestrally Jewish according to the Nuremberg standards. All right, this is the paradox. Admittedly, not overwhelmingly sort of frequent, but still present as a whole, and creating, again, the sense of distrust even towards your next door neighbor, anyone who could have been hiding this Jewish identity, just Jewish ancestry. Because there were also many Jews that tried to hide this as well, for obvious reasons. Second-degree Mischlinge faced somewhat less severe but still pervasive restrictions, especially in state-sensitive or culturally influential fields. Marriage and reproduction became tightly controlled domains, obviously enough. First-degree Mischlinge required special permission from a committee for the protection of German blood for any marriage. Such permission was almost never granted except when the partner was another Mischling or a full Jew, a step that, by the way, as we've seen, immediately reclassified the Mischling as Geltungsjude and removed even the limited remaining safeguards. There were people who decided to marry their loved ones and went to concentration camps for it. Just saying, by the way. Again, imagine being like someone like Werner Goldberg here that looks like the typical Aryan boy that was considered in this sense like just, no, you can't have much of a permission to mate however you want because you are not pure-blooded, by the way. Second-degree Mischlinge could marry full Aryans without formal approval. Yet the regime discouraged these unions through constant propaganda, social pressure, and administrative harassment, viewing them as dangerous further steps down the dilution of Germanic bloodlines. And in this sense, never underestimate the specific fascistic, sort of historical fascistic instantiation of essentially the carving of different sort of sacks of abuse within the system down the line. Corruption was present also in here. Some broader, again, privatistic paranoia and shady dealings were going on, of course, across the board. So yes, we're talking about in the outer face, the incredibly efficient Nazi regime for its purposes, but also actually a state was very difficult to run, especially with such preconditional ideology translated into actual law and administrative measures and so on. Escape from Mischling status was rare, degrading, and entirely dependent on arbitrary grace or legal acrobatics. The most direct route consisted of personal petitions to Adolf Hitler himself, who alone, in fact, could issue a German blood certificate, the Deutschblütigkeitserklärung, a document declaring the recipient equivalent to a person of full German blood. And these excuses were interesting because, of course, they showed that in line of principle, you could actually elevate yourself from a condition of racial inferiority. Hitler personally signed approximately 2,000 such exemptions throughout the regime, usually in cases where exceptional physical appearance, distinguished military record, irreplaceable professional skills, or the direct patronage of a high-ranking Nazi outweighed the documented ancestry. So it wasn't much a matter of merit alone, but also a matter of broader political and social clientelage and or matter of sort of propaganda. Eventually was a very ad personam thing. It's difficult to think that Hitler would sort of deeply inspect every single person in the sense it was mostly something proposed by society as such, right? Not only, of course. The case of Luftwaffe Field Marshal Erhard Milch became emblematic. When evidence of his Jewish father could no longer be hidden, Milch's mother produced a notarized affidavit claiming that her son had been conceived through an adulterous and incestuous relationship with her own, quote, Aryan brother, rather than her husband, a grotesque fiction that Hitler accepted in 1935, thereby preserving Milch's rapid rise to one of the highest military positions in the Reich and prompting Hermann Göring's infamous remark that he alone decided, quote, who is a Jew in the Luftwaffe. This is interesting for two reasons, by the way. The fact that he would maintain, as we've seen here with Goldberg and others, the same Jewish surname for different reasons, and this one was actually pretty heavy. Like, he was actually the son of a Jew, and, it was understood as preferably like being born out of an incest with a sibling, rather than being the son of his father, whose name he bore anyway, because he didn't change the surname for that matter, right? And the other thing in Göring's sort of worldview, that put it in this way, that of course there was basically a matter of simple decision within this arm, where Goering, as had distinguished himself as a war hero, as an ace fighter, and so on, that simply would overrun legality, which also seemed as, by some, surely also some kind of deserved. Like, look, that guy made it in any case, but in this case also Milk, like his appearance was sort of darker than the average. So, but in general, right, the rest of the law is undermined by such proceedings. But again, the structures of Nazi regime are, in fact, more sort of complex than we try to unitarily normalize them. Lesser-known exemptions protected other senior officers, mostly including generals such as Helmut Wilberg, whose reclassification was similarly secured through Goering's personal intervention. Court proceedings provided a more widespread, though still limited, humiliating and capricious alternative. The Abstammungsverfahren, the ancestry determination suits, surged dramatically after each major escalation of persecution. Immediately following the 1935 laws, again after the November 1938 pogrom known as Kristallnacht, and once more with the onset of systematic mass deportations in 1941. Petitioners typically challenged the Jewish identity of a grandparent by having the relevant grandmother swear under oath to extramarital relations during the period of conception, which, by the way, was not even approved for that matter, naming an alternative, quote-unquote, Aryan father of a deceased friend, former neighbor, subtenant, or cooperative witness who could corroborate the alleged liaison. By the way, if, you had, in part to prearrange, the degree by which this would be investigated, you can imagine being very loose. Everybody knew what this all about. And so you can imagine, even among the rest, sort of, the Germans, how this was understood at some levels as just like a illicit sort of bypassing of the law. Several factors contributed to the relatively high success rate in promising cases. The procedure carried no risk of status deterioration for the litigant. Specialized lawyers existed who were willing to take viable matters while refusing hopeless ones to avoid being labeled friends of Jews. Families usually cooperated, fully coordinating testimony and supporting documents. Judges displayed considerable sympathy towards elderly women who endured public humiliation by confessing adultery or promiscuity, especially when they had no prior perjury record. And just think about, for the morals of the time, how heavy this stuff truly was, right? It was a very tight society, by the way. So it was, from one side, also difficult to escape, not just hear the shaming and etc., but also certain fabrications here to elude the law. There were also the mandatory physiognomic examinations conducted by racial experts, quote unquote, relied on crude stereotype cliches such as hooked nose, thick lips, protruding eyes with heavy lids, red curly hair, excessive body hair, that were so inconsistent, exaggerated, and rarely present in full combination that most petitioners simply did not exhibit the complete set of supposed Jewish markers. That were, in this sense, sort of at some point purposely magnified to say, okay, well, this is kind of doesn't look like a typical Jew, whatever that is supposed to be, producing ambiguous or negative medical reports that courts frequently interpreted in favor of the applicant. And again, there were some Jews that actually did look like the stereotype, but since maybe like there were some specific missing elements, in the picture, like where, okay, oh, well, maybe you're not just like the full Jew, or at least we don't have to understand that you are not a German, Aryan, or whatever. And I am aware of the fact that in order to make this video, we should talk more about racial theory, because it's a bit difficult to explain in this sense what they literally believe at the time. But everything was a bit quite dichotomic. And so in expandably political terms, like the application of the racial theories at the time was also, as this shows, extremely complicated. right? So the ideology there is interesting, but the applicability even of some scientific or pseudo-scientific measurements was sort of a completely different matter. The military sphere laid bare the regime's deepest and most glaring pragmatic contradictions. Despite the ideological imperative to purge racially suspect elements from the armed forces, the Wehrmacht ultimately incorporated tens of thousands of Mischlinge. The Reichswehr had begun dismissing full Jews as early as 1934, but first and second degree Mischlinge were explicitly entitled and required, by the way, to serve under the military service legislation of 1935-1936, although first-degree individuals were prohibited from promotion even to non-commissioned officer ranks. Mischlinge soldiers participated fully in the September 1939 invasion of Poland, some unaware of their classification still, others deliberately concealing it to remain in uniform. The secret directive of April the 8th, 1940 ordered the immediate discharge of first-degree Mischlinge and those married to them. Yet enforcement proved highly uneven. The order was largely ignored, for example, in Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps, delayed or selectively applied in the Kriegsmarine, and sometimes quietly disregarded by sympathetic unit commanders. Tens of thousands of Mischlinge likely continued serving through falsified documents, concealment of physical markers such as circumcision, or tacit protection within their units. A renewed purge effort in September 1942 coincided with exceptional declarations of full German status for 118 Mischlinge soldiers and their wives, and officer eligibility for another 258, which I think is quite self-explanatory, and showing, by the way, how many, I think here the delusion, but there were some Jews, full Jews, according to legislation, that weren't really, it's that they were still hiding, and they were not really, they were concealing their own past to begin with. As the war dragged on, and manpower shortages became acute, particularly after the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad, various proposals surfaced to utilize previously excluded Mischlinge in auxiliary labor battalions, for example, though senior command resisted any large-scale reintegration. By autumn of 1944, desperation finally led to the forced conscription of between 10 and 20,000 first-degree Mischlinge and persons related to Jews in general through mixed marriages, for example, into special labor units of the Organisation Tod, where they were assigned to particularly hazardous construction tasks across the Reich and occupied Europe. That is, properly as slaves, right? So a non-full German in this sense. Scholarly reconstruction by historian Brian Mark Rick, drawing upon extensive interviews with more than 1,600 affected individuals, thousands of surviving personnel files, and newly accessible declassified document, places the total number of men of partial Jewish descent who served in the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and Kriegsmarine during the Second World War at approximately 150,000. With consistent estimates across sources of up to the same number comprising roughly 60,000 first-degree half-Jewish and consequently 90,000 second-degree quarter-Jewish Mischlinge, and even suggesting at least several thousand full Jews may have served based on sampled ratios, as a matter of fact. So just think about it for a moment, because they're not just large numbers, but they also reflect, in the military, they also reflect an incredibly complex society regarding this issue, and even the willingness and knowledge, by the way, of having literally undercover Jews serving in the military. Militarily, these 150,000 represented the equivalent of 7 to 8 full infantry divisions, which is a lot. And among these Mischlinge, were at least 21 generals, 7 admirals, 1 field marshal, and approximately 20 recipients of the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, Germany's highest decoration for battlefield valor. All right, we'll talk about historical German decorations because they are really interesting. Now, many of these men had volunteered or persisted in service precisely to demonstrate their loyalty, predictably also to an extent to shield close family members from harsher persecution, for example, or because the military environment offered relative material security and social camouflage in an increasingly dangerous civilian sphere. The Mischlinge prolonged presence in German uniform, sometimes until the very final phase of the war, by the way, stands as one of the most striking manifestations of the irreconcilable tension between the regime's racial fanaticism and the practical imperatives of a total war that the Reich could not afford to lose. In the occupied territories of Eastern Europe, by contrast, these fragile and revocable distinctions dissolved almost entirely. Local German authorities and security forces frequently disregarded the nuanced Mischling categories, treating individuals with any documented Jewish ancestry as Jews pure and simple. So that's definitely a double standard. It was aggravated by the fact that these were inferior races in the Nazi view. Deporting them or sending them directly to killing sites without further bureaucratic niceties. And as we've seen, given the numbers of Mischling in the Wehrmacht, it would be interesting to see if in the SS there was at some point, for sure, there was fewer, but because the selection was more stringent, but surely, like among, the Holocaust and other sort of genocidal executions, like how many Mischling killed other Jews, for that matter. This brutal leveling of distinctions in the East stood in sharp relief to the partial, inconsistent, and even shrinking protections that Mischlinge within the pre-1938 Reich territory were occasionally able to retain until the very end. The history of the Mischlinge thus encapsulates the fundamental incoherence at heart of Nazi racial policy. I would like really to leave you with this concept, like there's an obsessive quest for biological purity that repeatedly collided with social reality, but probably in a decisional sense, ultimately, like economic necessity, military requirements, the sheer administrative impossibility of its own ambitions, producing a system that was at once ruthlessly systematic and hopelessly inconsistent until the war's radicalizing dynamic finally erased most of the remaining loopholes. This also, think about this for all those who engage in Nazi apologism. Like, if you are going to be sort of exalting the Nazi racial policies, you are all adults with this, because it was definitely an indiscriminately patchwork display of essentially lack of interest in actual genetics, of probably to the complete brutality towards people that actually were less punishable according to the same standards were held by the regime and by were carried us out, even just out of sort of, if not enjoyment, of true conviction even. And as such, like, reflected a hellish reality that is not what we normally describe even for German society, right? We rightly claim that for the communist world, but it's not like living in Nazi Germany, regardless of the fact that, I don't know, up to 1943 there was no such thing like a war economy, and so it was simply easy, or even sort of just like an ideal life. Besides, if you were an average German, like, your living conditions in general, just even before the war, even by the world standards of the time, were not high, all right? And so these discrimination compounded a general sense also of distrust, disbelief, of some sort of acquiescence to the situation, because that kind of paranoia and sort of general alienation is proper of Nazism as well. Again, the idea we have often, especially in apologism, that these guys were again, dramatically, driven. They were actually the right side of history or whatever, and that everything worked well. They were so efficient, whatever. Actually, not just disastrously lost the war, but did so also for massive miscalculation that, in a sense, reflects this hyper-driven but still recklessly overreaching at least goal and application of the same that is somehow typical also of German culture in that sense. Right? Certain things work very well. Others are sort of just they must be fitting in where another, so we'll find a solution, even though it's a temporary one. It's just because that element of the machine has to fix the issue, but it's not about the whole machine at the end of the day. And there are different stories here that can also illustrate the strangeness of this whole. Werner Goldberg, for example, the guy here I'm using it in the thumbnail, like in the beginning of the video, exemplified really the absurdity and human tragedy of the system. Physically, and you saw him, like he embodied the Nazi idea of the pure Aryan soldier, right? Chiseled chin, high cheekbones, narrow, elongated skull, and piercing icy blue eyes. In 1939, his photograph was chosen, as you see, for a Wehrmacht recruitment poster captioned, quote, "the ideal German soldier." Right? Yet his surname obviously revealed his father's Jewish origin, making him a first-degree Mischling under the law. He fought in the invasion of Poland under the swastika until the April 8, 1940 directive ordered discharge of all first-degree Mischlinge. As we saw before, after returning to civilian life and his job in a uniform factory, Werner lived quietly until December 1940, when his father was hospitalized and, upon discovery of his Jewish origin, interned in a Jewish sanatorium destined for deportation to Auschwitz. So yeah, the poster guy you saw there for the Wehrmacht recruitment had his father, as we're exemplifying before in these kind of examples, denounced and detained as a Jew. Right. On Christmas Eve of the same month, Werner exploited reduced surveillance, however, to help his father escape. When the Gestapo discovered the flight, the elderly Goldberg was placed under house arrest pending deportation. In April 1943, Werner convinced his father to ignore the summons and go into hiding, saving his life. Father and son became the only survivors of their family, by the way. And Werner Goldberg has really an interesting story because he later married, had 3 children, and lived to the age of 84. If you Google him, you see he's obviously aged, but again, like he was young at the time, and he lived also pretty recent times. Then you have Wilhelm Stuckart, one of the most important jurists of Nazi regime, that unironically collaborated in drafting the same Nuremberg laws and represented the Reich Ministry of the Interior at the Wannsee Conference. The famous encounter on January 20th, 1942, where senior Nazis coordinated the final solution, genocide of European Jews, with ongoing unresolved debates about whether Mischlinge should face sterilization or full inclusion in deportations. It's a very well-documented meeting. There, Stuckart clashed with Heydrich over the fate of the Mischlinge, defending the laws he helped write by arguing that they should be sterilized to prevent procreation and allow the group to die out naturally as a consequence. On August 18, 1939, Stuckart had signed a decree on, quote, deformed births that became the legal foundation for the regime's euthanasia program, targeting newborns with malformations or disabilities. And in 1941, his own 1-year-old son Gunther, who had Down syndrome, became one of the victims of that program. The Mischlinge story thus reveals a regime trapped in its own ideological trap. In turn, a pseudoscientific system, truly pseudoscientific in as much as it went beyond even the time of the racial theory, normally like intending like the order of races, superiority and inferiority, classifying people by fractions, not just of sort of at that point physical, like biological ancestry, but of based simply on associationism, like some sort of congregationism, not even the full adherence to an open Jewish identity. A system of classification that was, however, repeatedly banned or ignored. And so that fell off its own rules when confronted with military necessity, lead to patronage, individual utility, or simple administrative chaos. The result was not clarity, but a grotesque and tragic limbo in which thousands lived as Germans while officially branded as racial hybrids, fighting for the Reich while officially excluded from it, and survived only through loopholes, concealment, or regime's own pragmatic hypocrisy until the war's final radicalization closed most of the loopholes and erased the remaining distinctions in blood. What kind of bottom line we can add? Well, indeed, this is incredibly interesting, as much as terrifying, astonishing, and also to be understood within the context of an era that is no more, right? Especially the last point here regarding the fact that we're even allowed to serve in the army, but they were not considered like properly full-blooded citizens either. They were sort of like neither mentioned by some degree. And in this sense, not even provided with much of a chance of elevation. You see, in the ancient Germanic world, you have plenty of sort of the Germanic ethnogenesis mythology that speaks consistently of slaves elevated, slaves of war elevated through some sacrifice to free men in arms, as fully part of the people. National Socialism did not have such a thing, right? And as I was saying at the beginning, this seems to be the most traditionally inconsistent aspects of the world. The fact that a Holocaust was needed to remove some allegedly, like if in tradition, especially Indo-European theology and so on, like if you encounter an inferior, you can't be threatened by that. Like you can, as long as you're inferior, right? If you think that, especially like this is valid for today's sort of conspiracy theories in particular, like if let's not even, this video will hopefully not get me in trouble for any reason, but YouTube is where, if you really think that there is somebody that is less than you that is ruling over you, there is something wrong with the entire proposition. This is literally the entire hierarchical foundation in tradition. It's not even just about the Indo-Europeans, all right? And this is something the Jews themselves believed, by the way. And so the question, talking about the ancient Hebrews, and still in theory, this is something all we should collectively believe, right? So the idea of distraction of people, like if you can't, like if you're right, just like in the Christian vision, that the Jews were discriminated against and ghettoed and everything, but they were to be maintained, they had to be preserved. During the Crusades, those uprisings, they wanted to steal the Jewish wealth accumulated because some of them had been, as you know, co-opted as administrators by the local governors because they didn't have, at the time properly, like certain money lending activities and so on connected with finances that were not fully legalized, but they were already accepted, telling the truth. That's also a thing that nobody tells you. Bishops, princes put down those revolts. Like the Jews were preserved, were shielded. And the ultimate point was like, we don't have to fear anything as Christians because we are right. Right? And so actually the Jews that are closer to Christendom in the bigger scale of things should be actually the only people to survive next to the Christian within Christendom proper, do show at the end, because the bottom line, in all of this, if you had asked, I don't know, a Charles V, a Maria Theresa, it's like dreadfully enough, like the reason also why the Jews were discriminated for, because in this theological framework, Jews were, as long as they remained Jews, they were destined to hell, right? So this was actually not a tender-hearted or sort of charity, humanitarian-based concern. This was truly understood in the most brutal terms that, in this sense, as you see, not even the Nazis were able to uphold. Just think of this when you see you don't see this, but I actually see a lot of comments on this channel of people who blame Christianity, that say it's bad, it's wrong, and because it's connected to the Jews, and you have this rampant Judenhass in the last couple of years in particular, for reasons that are also just, sort of, as I was saying before, mostly a matter of Islamist communist push that for some reason foretestators decide to back, even when they're allegedly on the right. And this is also one of the most, even an indicator that foretestators do not know what tradition is by definition, because tradition explains why plebeians do not know that, right? But here, never mind, right? Having, in fact, a sort of bigger perspective on this, you realize how, and this is, if anything, the greater comfort, and in moments of civilizational crisis, foretestators always fall even lower than they were before, right? And so that's the ultimate outcome in all these cases. And you always have the repetition of this Judenhass all the time that is, frankly, again, the litmus test to understand probably how few a person actually understands anything about European identity, tradition, legacy, Catholicism, and more. And really, we will, if anything, I want to make more videos about Jewish history, because it's not just very interesting, and obviously also misunderstood, at least in the terms, because, again, there is an academic knowledge that, say, also those that, I don't know, in the 1930s, in the 1940s, writing like nobody has today, that, in fact, foretestators feel separated from, because they're obviously complex and they do not know anything about such higher education, but they somehow want to tell their own thing, because, one comment on YouTube that nobody will ever read is important, right? Of course, I don't accept them, so it's much easier and funnier. But it's interesting because it's creepy. Like, this is not even what always struck me about this. It's not like it's a fully fledged, like, I don't know, the communists, of course, they were allowed, right? Communists were allowed in the West. Nazi fascists were at some point also probably sort of delegalized, etc. But it's mostly a fact that if you really believe in what you believe, like, you still fear and hide and make this passive-aggressive remark by your own standards, like, you're just not able to understand what even who you're supporting was supposed to believe. And just imagine that the history that we have made today is real. And I would like to know of you in such a situation that's just held accountable for your ancestry. And I'm not even expressing any judgment on the basis of that. I'm simply saying, that most of the people who align with such strange ideas that have never probably even heard about the story would immediately crack under pressure. Here we have Jews that were hiding because of obvious fear of persecution that went on fighting on the Eastern Front, right, including co-opted in some of the massive sort of ethnic violence that was unleashed there, and that maybe made it out of the war with children, and went on. Like, would you even be able to do anything like that? Like, this is why I make these videos. And at this point in Schwerpunkt, I realized that many people are more interested in the expectedly potential drama rather than any actual interest in history whatsoever. And it's becoming frustrating. I don't know where the channel is going, but let's say there are some moments where I see, and this was obviously in the past, in which I see ever more clearly probably the emptiness the lack of soul, right? The complete ignorance and darkness of the world around. Okay, that we have, that say if there is any trace of human life left, it is incredibly less valuable, less resistant than at any time before. And that the paradox is that those who sort of try to make it sound in a different way are the very ones who can't even, again, stick to the ABC of elementary knowledge. And that was I mean, it's actually very coherent if you think about it, but the scale, the unprecedented scale, the standards collapse that we're witnessing to is something utterly unbelievable. And I honestly didn't think that it would be so fast, or at least so probably like, missing, like something dissolving under your feet all of a sudden. But this is perhaps also a matter of perspective, because you have to grow a bit into it to also realize the extent of such things. Schwerpunkt is here, and I'm planned for now to not to abandon, not to have. I don't have any particular reason for this, but it makes me think, really, and I don't know what kind of future awaits us. We get lots of views. For example, the thing about the Byzantines got lots of views, and you see people want to know because, oh my god, this guy's saying the thing. Yeah, even though I made 200 videos, say, or so on the topic, and nobody ever even bothered to realize whether there was something similar to this alone. But I appreciate, at the end of the day, the fact that if my message is repeatedly coming across through this lamentations is partially absorbed by even just a minority of the audience, well, something can be built on it. That there can be a major maelstrom that washes away everything. But largely, we also started to make a bit more of nationalist, socialist history, and a lot of it, or at least something that I didn't expect to grow and so consistently in a way. So the fact that we are, it's obviously contentious stuff. Many people sort of don't care or accept the whole thing, but I see actually an overwhelming support, and especially where I make my point more clearly about this, right? And based on actual evidence and based on actual historical standards that are a very different thing from what people approach the thing from on a regular basis, this stuff, right? I remember that video, I was just looking at the likes here, they're all above, 96%, whatever, but the least appreciated, in the sense the most disliked, was the one on the SS, because basically I was pointing out all the most obvious things, that how they came into being, and the initially scarce quality, the later developing into something really impressive, but mostly also just by scale, not much just the quality that is also still part of sort of some broader standards, but just like the myth of the clean Wehrmacht and all this stuff. Like, if you live in a world where you literally have to make up this BS for standing for your pseudo political opinion, it means that your opinion is worthless. Or if you need to lie to get things across, or at least if you need to make up fantasy for having your message come across, or to present yourself to the world, that there is something that you deeply know inside, that is your own guilt, that you perfectly carry, and even way more heavily than the others in order to do so, that other people can't even see, right? So history requires a lot of discipline, a lot of sacrifice, a lot of work, which if you're not willing to undertake, it's never going to be substituted. It's never going to be reached otherwise. So again, we have a lot of stuff to cover. Some of these topics, almost all of these topics are new for the channel, but we're gone like this. I'm testing boundaries a little bit, just because these videos normally get demonetized and whatever, but not because of what you say, just because by standard, like Nazi history is always policed in this way, but I don't care personally. I'm not here for that after all. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.